Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art tonight. I'm Zara Stanhope, Curatorial Manager of Asian and Pacific Art, and one of the team here supporting the gallery's Australian Centre of Asia Pacific Art. First of all, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Kurrbal and Jagera peoples, and their and elders past, present and future. In the spirit of reconciliation tonight, I'd also like to recognise the role that these elders continue to play in our creative community, and also the passing of Dr. Ernestine Benita Mabo, AO, a prominent advocate for the rights of First Nations people and Indigenous education, as well as, of course, recognition of Indigenous land rights. I'd like to also acknowledge tonight Peter Aiken from the Queensland Police and Captain Casper Cooper, Honorary Consul, Consul General of the Netherlands in Brisbane. And just note the apology of Chris Sains, our Director tonight from Queensland Art Gallery. This is our final Asia Perspectives lecture for 2017, as many of you know, and the Gallery is really delighted to be continuing this 14-year partnership working with Griffith's Asia Institute at Griffith University to bring you this series of stimulating, informative, and I think you'll agree, insightful talks by leaders in diverse fields across society, culture, politics, and from across the Asia-Pacific region. I'd really like to thank Professor Caitlin Byrne, Director of the Institute, and her team, including Natasha here tonight, for their really close collaboration on the development and organisation of this program, and also to acknowledge our sponsor, Yearing Station. So tonight, we're very honoured to have Griffith University Adjunct Professor John Rodsted here with us discussing his work on the presence of armaments in the Pacific. It's great timing because, as many of you know, we've just opened the latest of the gallery's best-known exhibition series, the Asia Pacific Triennial, which is here in the building that we're meeting in. This triennial contains one of the largest presences of Pacific artists in its history since 1993 and includes major art projects from the autonomous region of Bougainville and Solomon Islands and Kiribati, which were organised by our Curator of Pacific Art, Ruth McDougall, and also our first project in Micronesia of Jackie-Ed weaving, developed by our Assistant Curator, Ruha Fafita. In addition, there's major works from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and a large body of work, photographs by senior Okinawan artist Mao Ishigawa. Both the Triennial and Perspectives Asia offer opportunities to engage with and be inspired by the culture in its intersection with contemporary art. Artists in this APT, including Marshallese artist Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener, are also not shirking from pointing out our responsibility to be aware of the local issues, and these include the impact of militarism and climate change in their homelands, as you'll see if you've looked around the exhibition. This is very apt, as I said, because it's great to be welcoming John tonight and his focus in thinking, writing and image making on these very issues. John's career is very varied, rich as well. He crosses academia and activism, environmentalism and extreme sports, you could say. He's been an adjunct professor since 2009, and I know that he's often spoken about here for co-leading highly successful student documentary photography in the field in Cambodia, and particularly since 2010. Not only does he create opportunities for QCA students to engage in meaningful work-related learning experiences with people and NGOs in Cambodia, but he also facilitates professional placement of graduates in Southeast Asia and mentors graduate students in the region. So his reputation really does precede him, as he's very peripatetic and often not in Brisbane. Like many who start their lives as press or commercial photographers, John has moved on from that field, literally focusing his energies on communities at risk in areas of conflict. He's taken his efforts to Cambodia, Afghanistan, Mozambique, Bosnia, Kosovo, Eritrea, Sudan, East Timor, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, West Sahara, and I'm sure there's more, John, and was the official photographer and field researcher to the international campaign to ban landmines and part of the team that won the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize. He's also spent considerable time in the polar zones and has begun a project on the effect of climate change in these regions. Tonight, though, he's going to focus more on the study behind his latest book, in search of safe ground in the Pacific. The topic of leftover World War II munitions throughout the Pacific and their impact on today's Pacific societies is not one that I think we hear so much about here in Australia. So I think it's wonderful to have John discuss his research and what the presence of munitions is meaning for a number of island societies. So I really want to thank John for giving us some insight into how he is focusing on engaging international governments and donors and bringing attention and budgets to the Pacific for the clearance of explosive remnants of war and oil removal from shipwrecks. So please join me in welcoming John this evening.
Thank you. Thanks, folks. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking some time out to come and have a little bit of a chat about leftover munitions from World War II in the Pacific. I've worked with a little NGO called Safe Ground. We were a rebuild of what was the Australian campaign to ban landmines. So we worked on the treaty that banned anti-personnel landmines and then the treaty that banned cluster bombs. And at that point we thought, do you close up and disappear, or do you find other valid work to do? And the work that we took on was to do research projects into places that you thought had a problem, and you want to create a conversation between where there's a problem and where there could be a potential solution. And the solution is usually first world money between a country that's a developing country and struggling. So that just gives you a little bit of a framework. We've done a series of books called In Search of Safe Ground, which is we did a big project in northeast Cambodia a number of years ago, and again that was with one of the graduates from Griffith University to try and get their career kick-started, and this is the latest one looking at the Pacific. I've always been interested in history, but I was very interested in Pacific War history because most of my professional world for 32 years has been photojournalism, and it's been conflict and post-conflict as my subject. So you don't have a thing like World War II and it just goes away overnight and all of a sudden everyone's happy and life is peaceful, life is good. It's good if you go back to a place like Australia, but in the Pacific it really is a region that was left and ignored by a lot of the big players like America, Japan, Australia, etc. They withdrew their forces, they went back home and left a lot of island nations with a big unexploded ordnance problem or stockpile problem or pollution problems courtesy of shipwrecks, etc. So that became the start point for me for my research. That's what I wanted to focus on, and we wanted to get a conversation going about how big that problem was. And if you find my brain wandering at times, it's just because I just got off a plane from Geneva yesterday or the day before, I think, and I'm extremely jet lagged. So here we go, see if we can hold it all together. That first quote before, those that will not learn from history will be condemned to relive it, I think it's absolute. Look back, somebody's got some lessons for you. It doesn't mean they're the right lessons, they've got things that you can learn from to try and have better decisions and better outcomes for what's going on now. And the first part to understand World War II in the Pacific was to research it. And research it at a level which was not a generic overview, typical history book level about World War II. Of course, you have Pearl Harbor as a benchmark, not a starting point, a benchmark. If you want to understand how World War II in the Pacific got going, you've got to look back into the 1920s. You've got to look at the end of World War I. You've got to look at the desire for imperialism. There's a whole bunch of things that build that pressure that gets Japan engaging in a conflict by 1941. And basically from December 7, December 7, 1941, they went for a very large land grab. They got as far north as the Aleutian Islands, heading up into Alaska, out towards Midway, of course Pearl Harbor to the east, Burma to the west, and down to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands to the south. So there was a big grab of land and a big area of dominance. You can work that map out. That basically shows the farthest extent of how far the Japanese got. And in the research that we started to do, what was important was to try to understand it on a small unit, battle by battle scale, not just the big picture. But the point is, what that map says is there was a huge amount of area that they took control of. How are you going to control it? That's a hell of a thing to try with resources, with spread out forces, with all the things it takes to control a massive area like that, let alone just having people to keep in control. Didn't take long for the Allied forces to get organised. They mobilised. I'm going to roll through the history part very, very quickly. But they mobilised, and the first face-to-face conflict was in the Solomon Islands on Guadalcanal. Now, the fighting was brutal. It was absolutely vicious, and the numbers that started of people that started to disappear are horrendous. Just on Guadalcanal, one little island in the Solomon Islands, 24,000 Japanese died and 1,600 Americans. 24,000 gone like that, 1,600 Americans gone like that. The numbers that you start finding out of what took place in World War II are of a grand scale, and they are of the end of a generation. They are a generation evaporating through to all sorts of issues. The big strategy of the Pacific fighting from the Americans' perspective in rolling the Japanese forces back was to get hold of runways. They wanted to have air superiority, cut off, don't fight all the fights, cut off areas, get to the next runway, have air superiority, attack the sea lanes, jump over to the next runway. So that was basically the tactic. And they would call it the wither on the vine. You'd cut areas off, you'd leave forces on islands, and you'd leave them to just wait out the war where they couldn't get supplied. Cost a lot in shipping too. This is just Guadalcanal. Honiara is now where Henderson Field is. That's the main airport for Honiara. And that's just the amount of wrecks that went down in Iron Bottom Sound. Now, they all went down with great loss of life. They all went down with lots of munitions, and they all went down with massive amounts of fuel on board. Just the amount of shipwrecks in Southwest Pacific, 3,100 ships were sunk during the war. It's a lot of shipping. All of those went down with oil. Over 300 of those were oil tankers. So we're off the bombs story. We're talking about the pollution problem. When you go out into Iron Bottom Sound to go across to the Florida Islands, you find oil slicks out there. They're still weeping out from the wrecks that are down there. Some of those wrecks could be cleaned of oil to make it environmentally better for the people. Others are in way too deep a water and could never be accessed. But the point is, if they are accessible, why haven't they been dealt with and cleaned up in the last 74 plus years? And as the American Allied forces pushed back, starting in Guadalcanal over here, went up through New Georgia, New Britain, New Guinea, got as far as the Philippines, but basically cut the channel up to Japan, and the rest, of course, is history in that sense. So the bottom line is, at the end of the war, this is when you start looking at the legacy. Theoretically, the conflict is ended. You need to get people back, and you need to get people to rebuild their lives, get a proper future happening. And the numbers that were out there all over the globe were massive. And no one had actually thought of repatriation. It hadn't been on anyone's agenda. It was like there's a war to be fought from all sides, whether it was a theatre in Europe or whether it's Japan or Australia or America or whatever. But at the end of it, when the peace package came around, you've got to get those people home. And you hurriedly try to convert ships to jam as many people on board as is humanly possible and push them back home. As just a benchmark figure, America had 12 million people in arms at the end of 1945, and 7.5 million of those were overseas, had to come home. Japanese had millions of men out in China, in all sorts of parts of the East, same deal. They had to be brought home, and there's only so many people you can get on a ship at a time. The repatriation was going to take many years. And basically it wasn't really complete until the end of 1947. So there were a lot of people who the war was over and they were desperate to get home. Now, in the case of a lot of the Pacific countries, and certainly in the case of Japan, they were coming back to a very ruined country, but they needed to rebuild. They needed to start a future, bury the past, and get a new future happening. Anywhere where you've got this amount of troops, you've got massive stockpiles of munitions that have been brought in to wage the war from both sides. And at the end of it, that should be dealt with. And teams were allocated with the task of disposing of the munitions. And again, you start talking about massive numbers in the tonnage of, what's it take to wage World War II in one of the two major theatres of the world? Well, just over in Vanuatu, there was a 9 million tonne stockpile. 9 million tonnes had to be got rid of. And all the way through where the fighting took place, there were ammunition supply points from small ones to massive ones like 9 million tonnes, and all of this stuff had to be taken care of and disposed of. It didn't go home, they didn't ship it back. Basically, disposal was to shove it in the sea. And barges would come along and they would simply take what they could find, load the barges up, have rollers off each side, and theoretically go out into deep water, 2,000 feet deep, and then get rid of the munitions and just lose them that way. Now, it's a pretty primitive way to get rid of munitions because it's not just because they're dangerous, they'll blow you up. They're also full of toxins as they break down. There's one of the compounds that is used in one of the very common explosives from World War I and then in parts of World War II is called picric acid. Massively carcinogenic. There's a whole bunch of issues. You don't want picric acid in your life. Well, if it's dropped into shallow water, as the munitions break down, and here we are in 2018, as these munitions are breaking down, you've got picric soup. With that picric soup, what lives in the picric soup? Fish. Who eats the fish? The local people. So it just starts to build the problem of it's a cycle. Now, when we started researching it, it became evident there were two things, and I was looking at it from a point of trying to encourage agencies to go in and clean up the munitions and to understand a starting point of what would need to be done. And you can break it down into two things. You can have the outer defences and the inner defences. The outer defences was as far as the Japanese forces got, and they had very stretched supply lines. They had very stretched manpower. They had a big area they were trying to hold on to, but they wouldn't be able to sustain that. And the style of the fight that took place was very much a running game. It was very much hit, counter hit, and it was very, very fluid in the way the battles went. Not heavily fortified. Once it got into inner defences, which is more like Palau, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, then there'd been plenty of time to dig very, very strong bunkers, and that became a very different battle situation. So what that does is it leaves very different contamination when it comes down to munitions. Basically, in the outer reach, yes, you've got stuff like the Solomons, New Guinea, Marshall Islands, etc., going over to Burma, and I think, yeah, when you get onto the inner stuff here, Palau, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, those ones. So, at the end of the day, here we are, 2018. I started working on this project 8 years ago with desk research and doing a lot of reading and getting into archives and finding out what I could. And because I've been working a lot with bomb disposal teams for the last 30 years, I've got a very good connection internationally, and it gives me access to places that have got some fairly large problems. And I picked the Solomon Islands as kind of the farthest extent and there was the first counter-conflict that took place as one example, and Palau, which was an area that was very, very heavily fortified by the Imperial Japanese Army. So I took those as the two study points. And we simply started looking for bombs. And this is a friend of mine, Steve Ballinger. I was having a beer with him last week at the UN in Geneva. He runs a little organisation called Clear Ground Demining, and they look for bombs, they clean it up, and they take extraordinary satisfaction in giving land back to the community safe. You know, people have been living with danger generationally. They're into 3 or 4 generations of living in a dangerous environment. Now, it looks like it's jungle. That's downtown Koror. That's central capital city of Palau. If you drive through Koror, it's some islands, there's a causeway, there's a little island in between, another causeway, nice hotel. And on the top of that little island with the gas station at 200 metres down there, 100-pound American bomb sitting there, which is never really good around a gas station. So that was one that was reported. You go up there, you try and work out how to get it out. Can you defuse it? Because you don't want to move fused bombs. It's a difficult thing. Multiply that times thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, start putting some very big numbers on it, you see there is a problem that needs to be cleaned up. And if that was in your backyard, in Brisbane, or if it was in Sydney or London or wherever, that would have been dealt with, there would have been infrastructure, that would be an outrage. That's a capital city. That's not even out in the country somewhere. That's a capital city. But of course, it's out of sight, out of mind. For many of the wealthier nations, they don't put focus on the Pacific. And I take it in a very simplistic view. That's simply unfair. You know, they didn't ask for a war to march in the front door and march out the back door, wreck their country, leave them with a hell of a legacy and say, bad luck, mate, your problem, see you later, we're out of here. Something needs to be done about it. And this is Honiara. You can see Honiara stretching along the coast, the capital of the Solomon Islands. This is going up onto Bloody Ridge, which was really heavy fighting between America and the Japanese. And when I go looking for this sort of stuff, it's simply you go door knocking. You turn up in a village and you walk in and you simply say, got any bombs? And people say, no bombs around here. They're not quite sure why you're asking. And so if you want to find bombs, you always ask kids. Kids always know where the bombs are. What were you like as children? I can see there's a bad one right here. If there was something that was out and about, all children always know where it is. And someone go, oh yes, there was some foxholes up there, there's some bunkers over here, there's some trench systems. Oh, then you find some of the elders for the villages and you say, can you show me? Can you show me what's here? What have we got? The guy in the orange t-shirt was a guy called Willie Bassey. And Willie's a village chief, and he was quite coy about stuff. He's been collecting all sorts of things. He's got a little museum. And he's got guns and helmets and water bottles and all of that sort of stuff. And he said, oh, you're looking for bombs? I said, yeah. He said, how much you give me for them? I said, nothing. I'm not giving you anything. If you've got bombs, you know, you can tell us, I can bring the police team up, we can get rid of them for you. And he says, oh, they're my bombs. I said, okay, well, what do you want to do with them? And he goes, I'd like to sell them to you. I was like, well, I'm not buying them. You know, I'm not giving you any money for the bombs. So we have this quite nice little interesting interaction together. And I said, well, you know, that's fine. You can keep them. They're your responsibility. And if you blow your kids up, well, don't come talking to me about it because that's your problem, not mine. And he goes, oh, that's not a very good solution, is it? It's like, well, that's your solution. And he said, I think I've got 3. I said, okay, well, would you like us to get rid of the 3? And he thinks about it and he goes, yeah, I think that's a good idea. We'll get rid of 3. So I said, well, I'm not going to take them. I'll call the guys from the police team and we'll come up and deal with it. So went and got the fellas from the Solomon Islands EOD team and they came up and next thing you know, we've got 69 fused mortars, safety clips out. It's all good to go. That's an old American foxhole on top of the ridge line. And then as we started working our way along the ridge line, we just found one after the next after the next. And the good part about that makes us feel pretty good is you take it away, it's cleaned up, and you are ticking a part of territory off and saying, that's actually now safe. Get on with your life. Yeah, your kids are now going to be safe, you're going to be safe, you can farm, you can do whatever you want to do. But that point of danger is now over. But that needs to be not just spot tasks like this. This just jumps a little further up in the Solomon Islands. So if you think of the Guadalcanal's down the bottom, the next major fight was a place called New Georgia, and then it rolls onto an island called Kolombangara. And Kolombangara was the Japanese withdrew to that. They were ready for the next major fight, and the Americans bypassed them. They just cut them off. They put a lot of sea mines in around them, didn't have the fight, and went up towards the Shortland Islands and towards Bougainville. So here we are, further forward in history. And the people over on New Georgia desperately need to expand land. They need a new village. And they look across the water to Kolombangara, which is largely uninhabited. There's some plantations there. And straight opposite their main town, there's a beautiful spot for a village. It's got a nice anchorage, it's protected waters, it's got good fishing, there's some employment out there. And it's not that they want to build a town there. They have to build a town there. They need it. It's not a choice. It's a requirement of their expanding population, and that's the logical place. The trouble is, we went across there with the police again, and that's as you come step straight out of the boat. We had hundreds of artillery shells. They're all unfired. It was completely stockpiled, garrisoned, ready for the fight that never took place, and then everyone went home. So it was just left behind. Whoops, we jumped on one. And a couple of 100 yards, and just as I walked along the beach and walked into the jungle a little bit, I had piles like this everywhere. Is it acceptable? I would argue not. It's something that has been hanging around for way too long. Come back into Honiara. Honiara, there's Mount Austin was a major part of the fighting. Well, Honiara is caught up to Mount Austin. And now the suburbs are coming up the face of Mount Austin. So there was a major artillery position on the top. It was massive ground fighting. It was also facing the sea within a range of naval bombardment, aerial bombardment. It got pounded. It's never been cleaned up. It's getting cleaned up now as the excavators are coming in there and the town is creeping up the hill. And putting in water, electricity, telecommunications. There's an Australian fellow I met up there, Nick West, who runs a lot of that earth moving. And his machine operators are terrified. They dig a ditch, they're continually hitting munitions and bombs. And he's continually losing people who just run away, scared. I'm going home. I'm not going to do this. Every time they start to try and develop, they are hamstrung because there is the presence of munitions. The police EOD team up there, which stands for Explosive Ordnance Demolition, they would love to be able to proactively clear these sites, but there is no budget. There is no money. There's enough for them to do spot tasks. If someone calls up in Honiara or within a few miles of Guadalcanal, yes, they can go out, they can deal with that, they can take it away. If you live over in New Georgia, Columbangara, wherever else, bad luck for you. You're stuck with them. And I found it quite embarrassing that I'd go and talk to farmers and they'd show me problems and all I can do is report it to authorities and I'd explain to them, I have no idea when, if ever, someone can come and make this safe. And the farmers are quite simply terrified by that. Again, back into Karora, as they are doing standard road work, as they dig the roads, they are uncovering munitions. And you've got an artillery shell just here in the bottom. And of course, that's been done with a backhoe. You're hoping you're not going to blow yourself up. The other thing that got interesting in Karora, and I'll get ahead of myself, but there has been, the area was massively booby-trapped also as defensive booby traps. So these days we call them IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and then we discovered only recently that the entire capital city is built on a booby trap field. We'll get to that in a little bit. But again, if you live, that's in the suburbs of Karora, if you live in Karora and you've got an a live artillery shell in your backyard, you probably would have liked that to have disappeared about 70 years ago, wouldn't you? Why is it so hard for there to be some form of international conscience to help these people close this chapter of history? Why are they stuck in this cycle of having to live with this and deal with this generationally, time and time again? And this is Chris Jamakana in New Georgia. He got hold of this land. It could be good farming land, but again, this is the Americans came into the southern part of the island. The Japanese are on the western part. It swept through. Every single time he digs the soil, he brings up stuff that is really quite dangerous. There you've got 2 grenades and 1 mortar. He's scared of his farm. He's scared of his farming. The style of farming he does is very surface. He scratches and he plants. He doesn't till the soil properly. His brother's got the next plot of land. He's too scared to farm. He just doesn't farm, doesn't use it. Too frightening. So, of course, even when you get into forestry, people are using the natural resources as well, and cutting down timber becomes a life-threatening activity as well. It's a constant cycle of a form of danger that hamstrings development. And even if you want to argue how safe or unsafe this stuff is, the very fact psychologically that you're stuck in this trap, you're not putting World War II behind you. You're not getting a chance to move on. Again, go to Karora. I highly recommend a holiday in Palau. If you like scuba diving, it is absolute paradise. There's a place called the Rock Islands, which is some of the most beautiful kayaking you could ever do. It's an incredible place. As you come out of the airport, you drive down a road and you turn right, and if you go straight across the road, 100 metres, and as you can see, we've got 2 aircraft bombs. We've got the top of a beach mine in there, and that's within, under a kilometre from the airport. The simple fact is it needs to disappear. Now, I said about there was the running game. There was the outer battle, and then there became the inner battle, which was more fortifications. And Palau was a place that certainly was heavily fortified. And this is when things, in a fighting sense, became absolutely bloody. Both sides lost thousands and thousands of men in the combat that went through Palau, Guam, Saipan, Iwo Jima, etc. And on the island of Palau in Palau, one of the factors of that is there are 600 caves cum bunkers, which have either been natural caves that were fortified, or they had plenty of time the Japanese military dug into the coral and created extremely strong fortifications. And even in a very funny kind of backhanded compliment, the American general, who was the Marine general in charge, at the end of that fighting just said the Japanese command were brilliant, absolutely brilliant in how that they had set up the defence of that island. At the end of the day, it went on for very many months, the fighting. Japanese military lost 14,000, they're big numbers. American lost about 4,000, I think. And that was a little coral plug. We pulled one lump of coral out of there, and you start discovering there's a cave inside. Well, there's 600 of these. And what's inside is actually a large cave complex full of grenades, mortars, rocket-propelled grenades. We had a few dead soldiers in the corner of one of them. And again, all of this stuff needs to be dealt with and cleaned up. I went down to the beach in Palau, and the people tend to live along the coastline. And I got into a conversation with one fella. And it was a bit of I was sort of leading him a little bit on it. I was basically said, so what do you do for a living? And he goes, oh, not much. And I said, okay. And but what do you do? He goes, oh, I fish a bit. I say, okay, you fish, that's good. I said, but what else do you eat? And he goes, oh, I eat spam. And I eat spam. If you don't know what spam is, it's basically a lump of fat in a tin. And you would have found it in rations back in the day. Spam is not great, highly nutritious food. And I said, okay, so you eat spam and fish. I said, well, what else do you eat? He said, oh, rice and pasta. So rice, pasta and spam. Sounds good. I said, what about vegetables? He said, oh, you get some vegetables, but not very much. And I said, but what about farming? Do you farm? And he goes, no, I don't farm. I said, okay. I said, what about your dad? Did your dad farm? He goes, no, my dad never farmed. And he goes, what about your grandfather? He said, oh yeah, he farmed. I said, where'd he farm? He said, oh, up there. You mean where the war was? You mean that area that's still saturated with bombs? You mean that area? That's where he farmed. And he goes, yeah, he used to farm up there. It's gone into a generational cycle that there's an impact coming down on people's health and use of the land. And for many folks, they're not even sure why they're not using the land properly. But it's just grown into that over the years. And I said to him, well, what did your father die of? And looking at him, I had a pretty good idea. And he said, oh, complications to diabetes. Is he morbidly obese? And I said, looked at him, I said, how's your diabetes? He goes, oh, really bad. I've got circulation issues, my eyesight's going, etc. So we started talking to doctors. And the doctors through many of the islands and nations, the biggest thing they're dealing with, over 50% of their effort is going into diabetes. Now, can you draw a direct cause and effect? No, but there is certainly a linkage through there. And it's something that there should be more study done on. What is the correlation between health issues, obesity and lack of land use? And what happens when you do give land back to people and give them a functional future? How does that change? Well, we talk about the wonderful world of IEDs, and I just was at the United Nations in Geneva the last 2 weeks, and I came back in 2 days ago or something, where we launched this project. And of course, the hot topic in Syria and come on in, folks, you don't have to stand there, don't be shy, come on up. No problem, you're welcome, please. The hot topic in places like Iraq and Syria is IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Well, you see this little thing sticking up there? That's the horn of a sea mine. That's a 1.5 tonne lump of explosive. And that's a lead tube which has got a cylinder of sulfuric acid inside it. If you bend that, the sulfuric acid will break. Sulfuric acid on lead creates an electric charge, fires the motor and detonates 1.5 tonnes of explosive. It's a big bang. It's made to blow up battleships. This is set a couple of kilometres inland as an IED, as a booby trap. Again, it's in Palau. And then we started to find these things. We started to look at concrete blocks around the place, which are used as bollards and used for all sorts of purposes. And this is in the capital city of Palau, in Koror. And we started finding some with wires sticking out of them. And that's when I I go and get a beer and I get my mate Steve Ballinger to do it, and he would go and he'd split these in half and find out that they were made as improvised explosive devices. A homemade bomb in a sake bottle was cast in a lump of concrete. They had the time to do it, and then they set them up strategically that if any troops went and took cover behind those, they could command detonate them. Very clever, very well planned out, very dangerous. Why is it still there in 2018? And of course, the good old humble landmine, anti-personnel landmine. We got a ban on those in 1997, but as they're working through these places, they're still finding them. Luckily, they're not finding big numbers of them. Luckily, the technology of World War II is rubbish, and it's old big metal plate things, which makes them quite easy to find, and they don't have the longevity due to weather. So that's the one little, glimmer of goodness in this, is if you go to Cambodia, where you find a lot of stuff is made out of plastic or Bakelite, and it will last for God knows how long, and they're incredibly difficult to find. So at least this technology was not as bad to get hold of. Then there's the sea. Pounded, aerial, naval, fighting, Marines coming ashore, people trying to repel them, everybody pounding at each other. And that little lagoon on the southern part of Palau is a popular dive site, and there's 40 of those 1,000-pound bombs on the bottom of that lagoon. Now, yes, you can set them off. They will make a very big bang. Are they dangerous? Yes. Is there a toxicity of that much explosive in the water? Yes. Can it be dealt with? Yes, quite easily. Put divers out there, have a lift bag. They make this sled. They just float the bomb a bit, put the sled underneath, drop the bomb back down on top, put a tow rope on it, haul it out with a Land Cruiser and take them off for a demolition. So the point is, there are people who will deal with this, and anywhere that's developing and has got a legacy of conflict has normally got a fairly high problem of unemployment. And there's a lot of people who are itching to get a job, and they will get well trained if there's a budget. If there is a budget and an operator who's prepared to facilitate that, you have no trouble finding people who are dying to get a job and clean these bombs up. That's not an issue. Again, another beach mine just in the waters around Koror, and again, hundreds of these are still around. In Koror Harbour, there's one of the things that the Americans did is they mined it before the fighting, and they isolated big forces in there. And this wreck was found in the 1990s, and there's over 28 tonnes of explosive, and they're all depth charges. Now, some of the depth charges were actually fully armed, which was incredibly dangerous. There's a thing called a piston trigger anyway, some of them were good to go. And if 28 tonne went off, there's a thing called the Geneva International Centre for Humanitarian Demining, which is the mecca of bomb disposal. And they did a study on it. It would get rid of part of the capital city. It would kill all sea life within a 16-kilometre radius in both directions. It would be absolutely catastrophic. Catastrophic in a physical sense, catastrophic in an economic sense, because Palau has also embraced the environmental future that they can have by declaring all their waters Marine National Park. So they're really trying to do something good about their environment. It's also 28 tonne of picric acid. So it's a toxic soup. And to dive down into that, yeah, it is. It's not a great place to dive, but it's something that needs to be dealt with. It can be dealt with. Get down in dry suits, you bag them up, you lift them, you plastic them underwater, haul them out, take them out of town and incinerate them. It's doable. It's all doable if there is budget that is available. And again, back to Honiara, there was a whole series of shipwrecks that we found along the water's edge. They were all full of munitions. And when you get them, there's certain things that you have to blow up. You try not to blow up stuff if you can, because again, it's a destructive process. But things like grenades, you've got to get rid of them, and that was getting rid of 2 tonnes of explosive in one big bang one day. And you see the size of the trees down there is actually quite a big bang, that one. But they're also trying, there's another problem that takes place in many parts of Asia Pacific where people seek out explosives economically, and they will use them for fishing with explosives. They'll go dynamite fishing. It destroys the environment. It's a one-shot thing. You throw a fish bomb into a reef, you'll shatter that part of the reef. It'll be a dead zone until that reef eventually grows back. It also creates a lot of cross-conflict between different communities because rarely do people bomb their own reef. They normally go over and bomb someone else's reef. So it creates hostility. I got off a fish bomber. The fish bombers, I did meet some, and they offered to take me out fishing. I said, no, thank you very much. Thanks for the very kind offer, but this is basically what it is. Now, it's a homemade fuse. It's basically a drinking straw. I'm not going to tell you what goes down. I'm not going to do a use-by manual of how to make a bomb. But basically, they'll look for old munitions, cut them in half, dig out the explosive, fill up a 300 millilitre bottle with explosive, stick a straw in the top. One bang will kill an awful lot of fish. Snorkelers will go down, scoop them up, get a bag of fish, and that's your process taken care of. Again, it's another issue. Environmentally, absolutely catastrophic. And that's a fish bomb. So people will go out, actively try to find munitions, interact with them. If you find an artillery shell, ideally 75 mil or bigger, because you'll get a good yield of explosive out of it. You take it, you get in the shallow water, stick it between your knees, get your hacksaw out, start cutting, hope for the best. What could possibly go wrong? Absolutely nothing. Well, the first thing that can go wrong is phosphorus. There are white phosphorus munitions out there. You cannot tell the difference. All the markings have eroded away in 70 years. If you pop a white phosphorus round, it will instantly incinerate on contact with the air, and you're going to have a bad day. So there's a market in these things, and if you're in the know and you walk into Honiara Market and you know the right stall to go up to, and a little wink and a nudge, and the bag will be passed to you, and you'll get a couple of these things, and you can go fish bombing. If you can't access the explosives, you can't get into this sort of trouble. And that's two fish in the market. The one on the left-hand side has been caught by fish bombing. You can see it's got the ruptured eyeball, the blood that's in the eyeball. You can also see organs that are getting squeezed out. So you'll find with the pressure, it ruptures their organs out of their gills, out of their anus, it busts their eyes open, and it makes the flesh all sort of pulpy. It's bad quality fish, but there is still a market for it. So, you know, it wasn't hard to walk through various fish markets around the place and find the evidence of it. And this is Frank. Frank was a fish bomber. He's over in Talagi, just north of Honiara. And Frank was fish bombing. You see, it didn't go too well one day. His fuse went off very quickly. He said he managed to turn his head, he got his arm to full extent, and it blew up and his hand disappeared. And the police didn't charge him because they thought he'd suffered enough by losing his arm. So he went straight back to fish bombing as soon as his stump healed up. He got caught a second time and he got 18 months in prison for it. You know, Frank's also just trying to make ends meet because Frank is a very poor man. The best he could muster, like one detonation will actually make you quite a lot of money. You'll probably get about $250 to $300 worth of fish, which will take a long time to catch if you're using nets or lines. So, you know, economically, yes, it is a valid method to get hold of fish. But, of course, it does that sort of stuff. And the farther you go away from areas where there's record keeping, where there's doctors, where there are police, the farther that you go out and you find these things taking place. Now, we asked the police, we said, how many people are killed fish bombing each year? And they said, we hear of about 6, but we believe it's much more. When you're out in New Georgia or wherever, the outer islands, if someone gets injured or killed, it's going to take potentially days to get to medical help. And if they die, then they just turn around and go home. Then nothing comes into the system. Anecdotally, we were working out around about 20 plus a year in the area around Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Russell Islands and Tulagi. So that's not even getting into the extended area. And again, they're poor people who are trying to make ends meet. It's a controversial way of doing it, but I don't put any blame on them at all for it. Oops, let's go backwards. And then now let's get controversial. Time for some controversy. Mustard gas, chemical weapons. World War I, that was the start of chemical weapons, and they were massively used over the battlefields of Belgium and France and the rest of it. A treaty was formed in 1922 that banned them, but during World War II, all sides had them. Everyone had stockpiles, and it was like a game of chicken to see if anyone used them, the retaliation was going to come swift and fast. And on the Russell Islands, which is the next island group along in the Solomons from Guadalcanal, that was a major ammunition supply point, and the Americans had massive mustard gas stockpiles, operational stockpiles there. The disposal method, again, push them in the sea. There's a place called Lever Point there, and you go to Lever Point, and as you step off the beach, you're standing on munitions. And there are two very distinct mountains of munitions from like knee deep, and they go out, it gets deeper and deeper, And if you dive on them, you will see these two very active points, and they go in parallel, and finally they go into deep water and drop off the edge into very deep water. The barges were loaded with munitions, phosphorus, explosive, mustard gas, and the troops were in such a hurry to get home, the moment they turned off the beach, they started throwing this stuff off both sides. The gap in the middle is the width of the barge, and there's these two mountains of munitions that just proceed off into the water. Now, that's exactly the same in any place where there was an ammunition supply point. Again, it was a breach of a treaty. Well, welcome to wars. There's lots of breaches of treaty that take place in wars. But were all the mustard gas canisters got rid of? No, they weren't. 100 of them were taken out only a few years ago from the Russell Islands. We found one artillery round, which was a mustard round, and you can tell. And the guy who's the head of the EOD team in the Solomon Islands, he identified it as a mustard gas canister. And the thing about mustard gas, it's a liquid. When you burst the canister, it vaporises, but you can tip it out. It is a liquid, and if you've got a contaminated area, it doesn't really break down. It doesn't really biodegrade. It will dissolve. If it's in deep water, it would probably just naturally disappear. But being accessible on land, and this is a question mark, it's not necessarily a statement, it's something that needs further investigation. But if you've got areas that are contaminated with mustard gas still in concentration, and kids are playing in this, they're potentially getting mustard gas burns. And in this one area where we knew the stockpile existed, this is very common. The kids come in and all of a sudden they're getting, which is, and you need doctors to go and take samples of this. You need people to do soil sampling. But to all intensive purposes, these are mustard gas burns, which the people are living with. They get all sorts of sores and issues that are coming up. It's another layer of problem that are lumped on people that they simply don't deserve to be living with this sort of stuff. And as any clearance takes place, yes, you will find more dead soldiers, and they will have to be respectfully recovered and returned if you can work out which side they were from, and respectfully returned to that side for proper disposal. As you can see with this, there's a set of femurs, a belt buckle, and the grenade, just to the right of the belt buckle. There's one thing wrong with that grenade. There's no clip and there's no pin in it. Good to go. Pick that out. I mean, that was dealt with by taking a fishing hook, putting a fishing hook around the top, getting 30 metres away, yanking it out and see what happens. And it didn't go off. That was good. And then the remains were bagged up and they were returned. Lots of things to do. One of the problems is nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows how big the problem is. There's what's a thing called a non-technical survey needs to be done, where you go out, you interview villages, you fund researchers to go out through the battle areas, you do data analysis, you work out, firstly, where there was never a fight. So tick them off. Work out where there was never a garrison. Tick that off. Isolate your search area. Go, there was fighting here, there are garrisons here, but there were no fighting. Reduce your search area, and then put people in there to go and talk to villagers to find out if they have a problem. This is actually a very doable problem. To fix the leftover bombs from World War II in the Pacific, it is not this never-ending pit of money. It's an extremely finite task. Palau has just been finished completely of clearance of bombs, and that's been taken 8 years and it's cost $6 million. And in the big picture, that's a pittance. That's an absolute pittance. It's doable. Paul Eldred, who's the head of the EOD in Honiara, he works with the police team at a place called Hell's Point, aptly named. But Paul, out of his own meticulous interest, keeps very good data every time they find something, every time something's reported. He maps it into a database, which it becomes very, very valuable. That needs to be done Pacific-wide. That needs to be something that's funded by a donor nation. Let's pick someone like special like Australia. But we need to get some money out there to sort these problems out. This was, for me, a little bit of a holy grail. The Japanese kept very good records of things, and this is actually the Japanese map, and it's got our own annotations on it. And we finally got, after 70 years, we got the defensive plans for Koror, which were phenomenal. And what you see with this is the red. This is downtown capital city. So the red areas are depth charges that have been booby-trapped into waiting for the invasion to come. And the blue circles are aircraft bombs. When you see a circle, for instance, this blue circle down the bottom, there's a number inside, there's 14. That's how many aircraft bombs have been booby-trapped in that small area. So to get this as a blueprint to work off, you could walk out and start rolling this up, that is gold. These sort of things do exist in archives around the world, and it takes detective work, it takes people to be able to simply go in there. It's never easy to find. It's never easy to find, but it does exist. And if you go from Koror, which is here, over to Babbledog, which is the big island, that's now a bridge there. And you see the Japanese forces expected the Americans to come in from the southwest. That battle never took place, but you get an idea how much stuff was set up there. That's still there. And that gives you just a little blow up down near where the bridge is. So, you know, you've got 75 mines here, 50 there, 44 there, 30, etc. Now, this was prime farming land, and it's been neglected and left for 70 years. Now it's jungle. So now it's good area. If you cleared it, it would be good crop country. But it's just generationally been left, and it's disappeared. And you find great little interesting partnerships with different people. There's an organisation called the Bent Prop Society. They're looking for remains of soldiers, and we're doing great forensic work out of archives. You can see a stick of bombs going down. Whenever there's a bombing mission, it's photographed to see where the hits are. If you say 10 bombs are dropped, then you follow your sequence of pictures and you see bang, 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 nothing, 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 bang, bang, bang. Go and check out where the nothing, nothing was. There's a good chance you'll find some unexploded bombs there. So forming partnerships with people who had different interests to try and come up with information becomes extremely valuable. And then there was new technology that is being developed, and at Hell's Point, which is just right at the end of the runway at Honiara at Henderson Field, there's 300,000 tonnes of munitions, and a grass fire went through it in 1943, and the place blew to hell, blew everywhere. And that's the training school and the base for the Royal Solomon Islands Police. Perfect. Walk outside, you've got a massive task. You can train anyone in bomb disposal there by walking about 50 metres. And it's going to take a very long time to actually solve that. But one of the things they do is they x-ray munitions because, again, you can't tell the difference between phosphorus and high explosive. So they've got a little portable x-ray, they just drop them through, and you can see whether there's a booster charge down the inside or whether it's solid or whether there's a liquid level. It might be a chemical weapon. You quickly separate them, and if it's phosphorus, you'll blow them up. If it's chemical weapons, you'll run away and tell somebody else. And if it's the good thing, to make it cheap disposal, if it's high explosive, they're trying not to blow them up. They're using a cheap industrial bandsaw. It sounds scary to put a bomb in a saw, but if you cut them in the right place, it's completely safe. You put them in, you walk away, it's remotely cuts them in half, exposes the explosive, and you simply take them out, put them in a demolition pit, throw some diesel on top with some old t-shirts, light a match, walk away. It just burns beautifully. It burns out, you end up with scrap metal that then you can recycle. Oops. And of course you need to train people, you need to train the local people so they can take a physical ownership of the problems that are there. Again, there's no shortage of people who are happy to do it. There's a massive shortage of budget to make it happen. And a big part of this is to have dialogue with the community, dialogue with kids, with women, with farmers, with whoever, and find out what they know. And you know, the old and the young are always a gold mine. The kids are running around and the old have got a certain amount of historical knowledge to them. And bit by bit, you'll build a picture of what the problems are, and hopefully you can do something about it. End of the day, if war comes to your land and goes through the front door and out the back door, and you are the sovereign owner of the territory, i.e. Solomon Islands or New Guinea or whatever, your country, they're your bombs, it's your problem. There is no obligation for the world to help you to clear them up. It's a good, fair situation, isn't it? So we can all just put our hands up and say, oh, bad luck for you, we're all going home anyway. Well, morally it's reprehensible. These people need help, they need money, they need assistance. It's as simple as that, and that's the mission and the message we were putting out at the United Nations last week. And I've got to say, very in a heartening sense, is that we got excellent dialogue with US State Department and a number of others who started to proactively talk about more money being potentially available. I said we did a project at the start of this talk in northeast Cambodia, in Ratnakiri, and it was a similar thing, looking at an area that was affected by bombing during the Vietnam War era, and nobody wanted to know about it or do anything about it. We got the dialogue happening, and within 18 months we went from zero interest and zero budget to a $10 million committed budget over 5 years to clear it up, and the job is getting done now. So the point is, if you can connect the problem with potential donors, things can change. End of the day, what needs doing? Well, how big's the problem? Work it out. Separate the areas, prioritise the areas, particularly prioritise the areas for those with a major civil impact, which are really affecting people's lives, and then work your way down through it. Clear the land and clear the sea, and don't forget the oil. Don't forget the places like Truck Lagoon, which is a diving mecca with lots of fabulous shipwrecks to go diving on, but are all weeping oil into the environment. There's a new organisation that just got formed in Newcastle here, near Sydney, called the Major Projects Foundation. They've just bought an ex-Navy, New Zealand Navy ship, which is a dive tender with a decompression chamber on board. They want to specialise in getting oil out of wrecks. They don't want to do bombs, they want to do oil. And I'm encouraging them to form a partnership between an EOD operation so they can have some bomb disposal guys, they can do the oil, they can do the bombs, and then you just leave beautiful historical wrecks that the local people can make money out of by encouraging tourism. Simply, what's it comes down to? It comes down to people putting some effort in. So that's enough for me blathering on. I've worked with some fabulous people on this. We've had limited support, but great support from everything from the Royal Solomon Islands Police, the Australian Federal Police, various EOD teams, the Japanese Mine Action Service, Golden West Humanitarian Foundation, Cleared Ground, Norwegian People's Aid. They've all been players. And I've worked very, very closely with Medarella Siusin on this whole project and many others. And Miriam Dupre, who's one of the graduates from Griffith University, she came and worked with me on this to make her honours project. So as we've done these projects, we try to find a good student out of Griffith because of the relationship and bring them into this world. It gives them some very hardcore real work experience and hopefully kickstarts their career, because there's a time when old buggers like me need to go away and we need to have another younger generation ready to keep going. So if you like getting really dirty, if you like getting really muddy, if you like getting really sweaty and crawling around with spiders and snakes and all sorts of nasty stuff, you can come and work with us in the Pacific Islands. But simply, these problems can be solved if budgets are freed up by nations to do it. The size of the task is finite and it is doable. So at that, I'm going to stop flapping my gums and take any questions if anyone's got any.
Before we go to questions, John, that was brilliant. I've been so looking forward actually to hearing you speak. Your reputation precedes you. I've spoken with a number of people from Griffith who have just said it's fabulously inspirational listening to you, and they're right. You set the scene for us tonight, which was brilliant. And true photojournalist, you gave us the pictures, but you also told us a story. You gave us the context. You told us about the people, the communities. What I found really brilliant, actually, is that you gave us a bit of a solution. I actually have come away feeling far more hopeful about the potential to resolve some of this than maybe I thought I would. And it has made me think, it was just a couple of months ago, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, in delivering his speech in Townsville at the barracks there, said this about our relationship with the Pacific. This is our patch. This is our part of the world. This is where we have a special relationship. We always have, we always will. We have their back. They have ours. We are connected as members of a Pacific family. Now, we all know that Scott Morrison was talking in relation to a lot of geopolitical shifts. Australia's got a renewed interest in the Pacific, but it strikes me that there's a real opportunity for this issue to be resolved, whether it's part of the $2 billion going to infrastructure
through the region. I'm hogging, I'm sorry, I am hogging the microphone, but I'm really interested in what is your reaction to the way that, we're starting to see our policy shift to the Pacific, and do you see this as being something that might be addressed in that?
Excuse me. I certainly see this as something that it's almost a cornerstone. How do you develop anywhere? And this is when I started working in Cambodia, so I'm going to do a bit of a parallel here. Excuse me. When I started working in Cambodia in '88, and different development was starting to come in, and people were saying, "Well, we're going to do agriculture, we're going to do building, we're going to do whatever." And I said, "Well, how the hell are you going to do that? It's all the place is a minefield. How can you have any form of development if you don't make the land safe? You have to have safe land because nothing can go on top of that." But then people were trying to farm. They were trying to do whatever they could to survive in dangerous ground. And I remember talking to a farmer, and I said, basically, you're farming land that is believed to be mined. And he says, through an interpreter, I must stress I do not speak Khmer. He said, if I do farm the land, I might be killed or injured. If I don't farm the land, I will starve. One was guaranteed, starvation. So it's the same with this. People have been in a hamstrung situation for 70 years. So let's go to the first pillar of development, give them clean land, and then the sky's the limit. You can do whatever you want. So yes, put the money where the mouth is and actually help this. Don't just look on projects that are above that. Get the land clean.
Actually deal with it. Yeah. We have a few moments. We've probably got time for 2 or 3 questions. Caspar Cooper.
I'd like to fire a question at you. You have enough evidence that the Americans dumped all that ammunition because they want to get rid of it, and you know yourself they've been paid for it, because that was the plan of it. Everything what was used, they got money for it. That's why they got rid of it. And the Japanese left a lot of them. Why don't they go after these countries and say, listen, we need money?
Good question. Why don't they go after it? In a legal sense, there's no legal obligation to do it. There should be. There should be an obligation. And the talks we had in Geneva last week, the biggest funder has been America. Traditionally, they have put a lot of money in. We were saying, well, actually go out and finish some projects. Really work the cost out and put the amount of money in. But also from an Australian perspective, it is our backyard, particularly when you pick on places like, in the massive ammunition supply point that was dumped into the ocean from Vanuatu. Solomon Islands, that's our closest neighbour along with New Guinea. Let's help those two out. That's right on the doorstep. And as you roll back up through the Pacific, we just need commitment from government. So I'm going around in circles here a bit, but yes, the governments need to prioritise this. Yeah, there's all sorts of economic things that come and take place. But again, we need to get back to the base to clean it, because it's not just about the economic benefit that a corporation can make and take profit out of the country, but it's about what the benefit for the average people will be as well. I'll give you a little quirky, very weird thing. Land ownership, and this is the thing that there's an anomaly in the which I found in the Solomon Islands. A lot of areas of some of the best agriculture in the Solomons was handed over to big corporations pre-World War II. So pre the Solomon Islands being an independent nation, back in colonial days, Lever Brothers, Lever and Kitchen. Lever Brothers control over 430,000 hectares of prime land still to this day in the Solomon Islands. And they were given it on a 999-year lease.
Wow.
Now that's ridiculous. Now, then you come back to the concept of land ownership, bomb ownership. Well, there's an argument they actually own the Hells Point area where there's a scattered 300,000 tonnes. So our argument to them was, well, mate, you own that. You need to actually sort that out. So you can see how that dialogue's getting interesting. But the bottom line is, yes, we need the budget. One of the things that I was very frustrated with at the United Nations the last 2 weeks is basically zero participation from the Pacific Island nations. It's not that they don't want to be there. It's damned expensive to get there. It's very expensive to send a delegation, and the Pacific Island nations are not rich. To hang out in Geneva would just about break the Bank of England. You can't even afford a beer there, let alone finding somewhere to live. And we're trying to get sponsorship from different nations to try and allow Pacific representation to get over so they can actually start presenting their case. It is a very unfair situation internationally, UN level all the way down. Yep.
One more question, Tess.
Just to follow on from that last point, I'd like you to speak about the element of this that you haven't said anything about yet, which is the dialogue that you have had with Pacific Island governments and bureaucrats about where this fits in terms of their planning for their countries, because I would suggest that once it gets on their plan, talking to donors becomes very easy. But donors aren't interested in talking about things that don't appear in national plans. Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu all have national plans. So what are you doing in order to, if this is such an issue in terms of future development, how is it getting onto these structures? Because that's where the money comes from.
Yeah, good point. We've got dialogue with that. The portfolio in the Solomon Islands for this is Karen Gallikale, who's come out of the Prime Minister's office. She's the Permanent Secretary for Police, Correctional Services, and basically the whole EOD clearance thing comes under her banner. Desperately hasn't got the budgets to do it. They can barely keep the team going at the moment. And we were trying to arrange sponsorship to get her to the UN, and we didn't pull it off this year, but we will get her over there next year. It is on their plan. Same with the good news story has also been Palau, because Palau is engaged with international treaties, and they're the only country in the Pacific that's fully engaged on international treaties. So they've signed the Mine Ban Treaty, they've signed the Cluster Munitions Treaty, and what that does is it puts you inside an international club of where there are donors and donor money is available. So the more we can get people to engage, the greater chance they're going to have of getting dialogue with potential donors. From PIFS, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, it's certainly been within their strategy, and they want to get stuff done about it. It's all come down to the lack of money. So there's not really a lack of people wanting to do it. There's been a lack of budgets to be able to either get to where there's dialogue, but on national plans, it's written into many of them. The New Guinea government's got it written into their stuff. The New Guinea government has also not been that easy to liaise with. But just in the last couple of weeks, there's been some missions out in Moresby talking to the government, and they're starting to turn around and thinking about what they can do. So there's a lot more to be done. There's a huge amount more to be done. Now, our little organisation, we've got the budget, which is probably, it's minuscule, so we do what we can, but we need some proper money. We don't need the money, but the Pacific Island nations need budgets that they can actually engage on an international scale.
One more? No, Natasha's saying no. We've got to come to an end. Okay. John, thank you very much. Just before we leave tonight, I'd like to say a few words. You talk about dialogue, and I think you've really started an interesting dialogue. I was on social media while you were talking, and hopefully it's a dialogue that will gain a fair bit of traction, through various channels, and the time, it seems, is right for that dialogue. You also talked about partnership, and I'd really like to finish this evening by again thanking QAGOMA for a really outstanding decade and nearly a half of partnership, so that we can actually engage in dialogue on issues that do have significance for us in the region, and learn a little bit more about our region as we're doing that. In particular, Zara, Ruth, Tarun, who's not here but often is, thank you. You've done a really fabulous job of assisting us through this process. You've been really incredible in showing very warm hospitality to your space, your gallery space, and I'd like to particularly congratulate you on APT9 as the curatorial team. What a spectacular job you've done. If you haven't spent time wandering through, put aside a couple of weekends, I'd suggest, and really enjoy it. It's here for the next couple of months, so it's something that's really special to Brisbane, and we're really proud that we're able to work with you and share in some of that. I'd like to also thank the Griffith Asia Institute team. We've got Natasha, Kalia and Lucy here tonight. You do a fabulous job in bringing these things together and keeping the rest of us on track. So thank you. I hope you all get a really good rest over the next couple of months before we start on our 15th year of partnership next year. And lastly, to you, the audience, thank you for your support. Thanks for turning up and spending time with us and engaging in some of these topics. It's always good to have a really diverse group of people. So I wish you well, have a prosperous and peaceful festive season, and we look forward to seeing you, what's next year, 2019, when we start this series again for next year. So enjoy the rest of your evening and look forward to seeing you again. Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you.